Welcome to AML Voices, how AI can impact your financial crime compliance program. My name is Joe McNamara. I'm the Director of Solutions Marketing here at AML RightSource, and I'm super excited to bring you a panel of experts today to really dive into the topic that I'm sure everybody has more or less been inundated with over the course of the last 18 to 24 months, and that is, what the heck are we doing with AI? Um, but before we get started here, I just want to introduce a couple of our experts. So, Carrie Gilson is a Senior Vice President, Director of Financial Intelligence and Analytics at US Bank. Sitting next to her is Tassine Rabbani, an incoming AI ML postdoc at the University of Chicago. And then heading up the rear, though definitely not necessarily where we want to stick him, is J.R. Helmig, co-founder of finint.ai. So, guys, before we get started, and certainly want to start diving in, want to set the agenda for the conversation. As I mentioned before, AI can be such a large topic. Tassine is shaking his head. He knows the some of the difficulties that might come if we don't actually scope this correctly. But ultimately, what we're looking at is really trying to set the stage for today's AI conversation, right? And from there, we'll probably jump into more from Carrie's perspective in terms of real world use cases as well as practical applications in the financial compliance space. We'll certainly, I expect we're going to cover some common pitfalls and risks. And then finally, we'll follow it with practitioners and certainly things that they should be thinking about now as well as long term. But rather than me continuing to kind of drone on here, I kind of want to flip it over to you guys. So, JR, I'm actually going to start with you in terms of helping us set the scope for today's conversation. Do you want to give us a little bit more around the concept of one, that AI in financial crimes compliance really is not theoretical anymore? In a lot of ways, it's actually here. But just curious from your perspective, could you clarify what AI is and kind of what it's not in the lens of today's discussion?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. And hello, everyone. So, for context, I'm going to bounce between the past experience in the intelligence community, in regulated entities such as banks, and as well as working for regulators and vendors. So, the answer to the question that Joe asked varies greatly depending on which hat you're wearing. So, I'm going to use the buckets of traditional AI, generative AI, and then the future AI, because I think they're three very different things. In traditional AI, that's been around us for 50 years. And in the last 20 years, especially, you think of things like transactional monitoring inside banks, you think of stress testing inside regulations or banks, and you think of things like KYC, EDD. Does this person match a profile? Are they the profile that we care about? And do we have to automate some sort of reporting for it? So that's what we would think of traditional AI inside the governance, risk, and compliance space. If we're thinking everywhere else, that's where you get to things like the maps inside your cars, your cell phone talking to your computer, and Microsoft Outlook being able to summarize something that you're typing along or recommend the next word. So that's traditional AI. What's happened in the past 2 or 3 years is we've been able to lower the barrier to entry for everyone else. So you no longer have to be a data scientist or a PhD like Tassine to be able to use AI. It's democratized it, if you will. And so now what's happened is the pendulum has swung almost completely the other direction. And that means that now AI is in the hands of everybody's smartphone. And we have to be cautious about how we employ that. No different than we don't want to give our teenage kid drivers the keys to a Ferrari. We want to have some guardrails. We want to have some brakes and some airbags kind of thing. So we'll talk about that. But none of that really prepares us for where we are going in the next 3 to 5 years. And that's the future of AI. And that's where we as users, as consumers, as practitioners are ready to turn the keys over to an AI agent to where they are going to be making decisions on our behalf that we are compliant or we are responsible for, and we bear those consequences for, but yet we're not even aware that those decisions have been made. And so that's really where that future is. And there's a benefit to that. There's also a risk to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Joe?
100%, right? And I think that last part is probably the most clarifying statement in terms of there is risk associated with utilizing this new technology. And in some cases, not necessarily new, but new applications of this technology. Carrie, I want to jump to you just in terms of, number one, under the guise of the fact that AI really is not new. There are some examples that kind of already exist in the financial compliance space. From your perspective as more of a senior practitioner and certainly someone that sees this on a day-to-day basis, like what are some areas, number one, that you guys have seen over time that have been, super useful to your teams? But then number two, probably transitioning more into where you see the application of this type of technology going in the near future, and then certainly we can get into the far future as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Joe, and thanks for having us here today. Very much appreciate it. And I think JR kicked us off nicely, setting that background. You're right, right? So AI is certainly not new, and I come from a traditional sort of banking background. The use of machine learning, particularly in the financial crimes prevention space, is certainly not new. We have been using machine learning in various ways to enhance detection of potentially suspicious activity through transaction monitoring. Certainly, there's deep experience and expertise in machine learning and AI within the fraud space as well. So many vendor solutions are rooted in these technologies and these analytical solutions and have been used for many years. I think within the AML or anti-money laundering space specifically, it's been a very slow transition, right? To be able to adopt some of these more innovative, advanced analytics to elevate and enhance the productivity of our programs overall. I think that's primarily due to very strict regulatory expectations, right? To be able to explain the techniques that we're using across our programs, whether it's transaction monitoring or within the KYC space, but to be able to explain what the model, what the tool is doing, and even more specifically, be able to align the model's output to the intention of the program. So being able to say, here's how I have identified suspicious cash activity, as opposed to simply saying, well, the model identified this activity as suspicious. Maybe we don't know specifically why, but being able to tie your detection and your results back to your objectives is something that the regulators, I believe, have held us to for some time. So we continue to see sort of this mix or this balance of rules-based logic or rules-based detection scenarios in the transaction monitoring space. I would say with a bit of machine learning sprinkled in over the last decade or so. That's certainly changed it at a very rapid pace. I would say more rapidly than I even anticipated. I think I was on a panel just this spring, and some of the projections and statements that we were making at that time, we've blown past that in terms of speed. The introduction or the application, I should say, of Gen AI within the banking space, I think, is moving at a very rapid pace, even in the compliance space, right? There is very much a focus and aggressive appetite to bring in Gen AI solutions to assist analysts, to assist investigators with the review of the alerts that are generated, and to act as an assistant or a co-pilot in generating narrative or summarizing data sets. And really, I can see that within my own bank and across the industry, the teams are really focused on how quickly that can be done, how quickly they can adopt and bring folks up to speed on these newer solutions that are more broadly available, as JR mentioned.
Right. Well, and I think there's kind of two elements, and I want to go to you in a second to scene. But to kind of put a cap on, Carrie, what you just mentioned too, there was actually a recent Gartner survey that revealed, I think based on what I was reading, that 66% of finance leaders believe that generative AI will have the most immediate impact on explaining their forecast and budget variances. It goes on to kind of tie that together and say that, AI is going to be more of an augmentation rather than a straight up replacement to human workers. And certainly that's always kind of top of mind as we have these conversations, especially in our space. Um, there was another study that came out by Citi that actually suggested that close to 54 or 55% of jobs have the high potential for automation in our space. Um, which in some cases is a little bit higher than other industries. But you know, to seen from your perspective, certainly some of the higher thresholds are kind of minimum expectations that are required in a more regulated space that we're in. They're not new and they're not necessarily overly unique to just our space. Obviously, there are other regulated spaces that you've seen, but from your perspective, could you give us a little bit more insight in terms of how do you pull off the cover of kind of that black box, or kind of figuring out the way that these models work in a way that can not only be documented but can certainly be defensible, as practitioners in this space are working with regulators to ensure that their compliance programs are where they need to be.
Right. So I would start by saying that we sort of benefited from there was a privilege of the neural network being a black box in that, we had some complicated relationship that we wanted to model, but we didn't know necessarily what were all the variables that would play into it. So the benefit of the neural network was to say, okay, well, let's just throw millions to billions of parameters that aren't necessarily interpretable to model this relationship. And that was sort of a means to an end. But as you explained, now we need what we call explainability and interpretability for the decisions, actions, and outputs that come out of large language models. Um, and one of the ways, so we're still working on this is an active field of research. Like if you were to search explainability, there are thousands of people actively working on this area. But there are things right now, if you wanted to integrate agents or AI, generative AI into your workplace to control the behavior to some extent. The first being that we users of this, especially model owners, need to control the types of data that their agents and models are training on. We have control over the types of data that we want our model to learn on. At the end of the day, if you were handed an agent, you can make that agent better by supplying it with documents, supplying it with new training data, supplying it with new patterns that you would like it to learn from. But that gives you a lot of control. And with that type of control, you need to make sure that some of the things that you want your agent to learn on, it does not contain things such as, sensitive data, especially in medical spaces, GDPR or PI, but even in financial spaces, we don't want models to necessarily memorize quote unquote irrelevant pieces of information such as, social security numbers, specific details about the individual's uh, completing transactions, right? So this is the type of space, especially for leaders within institutions who want to progressively integrate agents into their organizations. They need to think about what are the types of data that we'd like our agents to sort of benefit from and augment them with. And like you said, it's all augmentative, right? We're at the stage where, JR described the scenario, which I would argue is more future AI, handing everything off to the agent, allowing it to make complex decisions. We're not there yet. And, we could debate about whether we will ever reach that point in time, but the human in the loop is so powerful at this point and necessary simply because, agents are still prone to saying things that aren't necessarily correspondent with reality, and not necessarily aligned with their values. So for leaders who want to integrate generative AI into their organizations, they need to start thinking about, well, you give me an agent, I want it to learn our business practices. What types of data are acceptable for our agents to actually ingest to help benefit, whatever decision-making process that we would like it to help us with. And you, as a user of it, have a lot of control over what types of data these models need to ingest. Um, so yeah, so I think right now we humans are entirely necessary to uh, basically control the behavior of these agents. So leaders who want to integrate generative AI into the organization, they need to start thinking about the data side of the model versus the output side, because the data corresponds to the types of behaviors that you're going to get out of these models. So I would say anyone who wants to use generative AI needs to start strongly considering what types of data am I comfortable exposing to an agent.
Well, and you bring up a couple good points. And JR, I want to come to you next. Number one, just to kind of talk about, from a data perspective, right? What are some of the capabilities that are here and now? And certainly, I think, based on some of the work that you guys have done at Finent AI, there are some pretty cool applicable examples. But beyond that, too, I really want to position it from the perspective of what you'd mentioned too, Tassine, and that is, the augmentative element here, and making sure that, at the end of the day, when you look at the highly specialized and trained, analysts and professionals in this space, one thing's clear, and that is, we're having these folks do a lot of repetitive, kind of low level, work that quite frankly kind of is below their intelligence, and certainly an area where there's opportunity to augment those processes, elevate those individuals, and make it so that they can focus on what many coin are the true risks. And so, Jr. From that perspective, and Carrie, I'd love for you to chime in on here too. But from that perspective, what are some ways that we can be looking at developing either these models, these LLMs, overall generative AI, in a way that's going to support the specialist, support the analyst, all the way up through, some of the higher levels within an organization?
Yeah, Joe, that's a great question. So I think we need to bifurcate the conversation quickly, and that is we have done a lot of work over the past decades when it comes to, say, KYC and transactional monitoring. And we think we have that down from a process. But here's some chinks in that armor. We don't examine 99 plus percent of the transactions that occur to the final outcome, meaning that we say we're going to run all these transactions through our system and we're going to say, are they likely, guilty or not guilty? But we often don't know on the ones that we say are not guilty. We say they're clean, but we don't follow them out for 3 to 5 years to see were they part of a bad guy network and did they commit some sort of fraud that we just didn't see at that particular time. So what happens is we're assuming that we were accurate in that training population. Well, if we're 1% off on 99% of our transactions, that greatly changes our confusion matrix and our ROC curve and other ways of measuring accuracy and precision of recall. If we then take that modeling perspective and now we dump it into generative AI and we put it into agentic AI or the future of AI, all we've done is we've enabled ourselves to go off the rails that much faster and to a greater degree. So what I propose is when you're building these training populations, you talk about here and now, you have to be able to start from the most expert gold standard data that you can. We have beat the crap out of this level of population within our consumer base. We know this level of transactions. We have examined it 6 ways to Sunday, and we feel confident that they represent an outcome that we actually know and defend. And a lot of times that takes us several years after the transaction or when we've had the relationship for several years. From that, then we go and we infer and we make all these other sweeping generalizations for rule-based systems and different inferences and so forth, which are critical to LLMs. The second point, and I think a lot of people lose this or they don't consider this, is they have to be able to understand what kinds of analytical problems and what kinds of business problems are conducive to LLMs versus neural nets versus business rule systems versus other types of reasoning approaches. Just because I can put something into an LLM doesn't mean that the LLM is the best application or the best methodology for that business problem. And I think that we have to be able to tease some of that out, again, in a crawl, walk, run kind of approach where you're piloting and you're saying, can I identify this kind of fraud in an LLM? Is that the best application for it? And do I have the right people asking the right questions? And that, as far as we are now in the space, that's still a bit of an exploration. And we have to be able to do that, which is sometimes tough for a heavily regulated entity like healthcare or, financial institution.
Right. Well, and Carrie, I want to come to you next because I think in a lot of ways what JR is getting at here is number one, we've got the folks that can think critically and certainly can look at these problems to your point, JR, 6 ways to Sunday, right? And I think the overarching question or kind of challenge becomes what kind of tools are fit for purpose, and certainly where are we investing, that particular focus as it's going to relate to, again, short-term quick wins for our people, as well as kind of the longer marathon builds over time that can surely elevate the compliance across the map. But, Carrie, from your perspective, what are some of the areas that you and your teams are certainly evaluating or have come across? And either, we can start with kind of what's here and now, and then also, I'm hesitant to use the word aspirational, but certainly what's on the roadmap moving forward.
So maybe I'll even comment on the sentiment of a roadmap here, right? And this perhaps falls into the risks and pitfalls category, but I think important for where we are in the discussion. Not stepping back to think about where and how these advanced solutions can help your program, and how they all fit together within sort of your strategic objective. I think is a mistake that we're seeing across the industry, right? I think there's a lot of excitement, a lot of availability in terms of vendor offerings, et cetera. And I think folks are very excited to try to see if generative AI can help solve this problem or that problem. Can it help me summarize this document faster? Can it help me take meeting minutes and absolve my staff from having to do that manually? But I think thinking about your big picture and how all of these agents perhaps fit together holistically is a step that cannot be skipped. So, are you going to buy multiple solutions? Are you going to pursue a venture with a consultant and perhaps customize a solution to fit many needs? I think really taking a step back to think about your strategic objective and what problems you're trying to address, or what processes you're trying to improve with this technology is a prudent first step. That being said, I think that we are doing a good job of categorizing and prioritizing across the industry. So where's the low hanging fruit? Where are the truly repetitive tasks where there's very low risk in the machine making a potential mistake or a hallucination occurring? Where will we have a significant level of human involvement still to ensure that the model results are appropriate? And not just checking to see if the language that perhaps is generated on a particular process is reasonable, but does it make sense? Is it value add? Is it giving us what we need? We don't want to turn folks' jobs into just making sure that the model spit out what it was supposed to in the form that it is required to do so. But is the information meaningful? Is it quality? A quality summary of information? Is it constructed in a way that we can use it? Really shifting our folks to be not just checking the box that the model performed as intended, but true quality control or quality assurance analysts to confirm that that the model is giving us what we need, and that we're really achieving the savings or the benefit that we intended. In terms of where we're seeing use cases, like I said, I think that the financial industry, is doing a good job of really bucketing the narrative generation where there's very low risk. So summarize these meeting notes so that I can determine next steps for this project. Performing QA or QC across a population of documents. So making sure that certain fields are completed or populated in the required format according to our procedures. Confirming that that one document matches procedure as it's required to. Are we completing each field within a document as according to our procedure? So these things where it's really providing us a second level of review, validation, quality control. I know that folks are very keen to take that a step further and leverage generative AI to provide initial drafts of alert review summaries, and ultimately help us compose SAR filing narratives, et cetera. But as you progress, right, the risk certainly increases where you're sort of the penalty for making an error increases, is where we're sort of treading lightly.
Right. And again, I think the crawl, walk, run approach certainly fits, most, fittingly here. We did get a question, which I failed to mention in the beginning of this. So folks, everybody that's out there, obviously my job is to moderate this conversation, but there's only so many questions I can ask. If you guys have questions, feel free, please drop them in the Q&A function. We're actually going to get to this first one here from Fabio. And I think it's going to be a toss-up, JR, Tassine, whoever gets to it first, you go for it. But essentially, Fabio asked, what's the assurance around data confidentiality on PII? And more specifically, things that are exposed to agents and LLMs that are learning from the contextual behavior that may include PII. And potentially, I'm not sure about this part, maybe details of SAR filings, which are strictly confidential. My thought initially kind of goes to private LLMs and private systems, things that, for all intents and purposes are considered walled gardens, where they're not publicly accessible, and they're essentially within, the confines of, your institution's environment. But, from both of your perspectives, what do you guys think about this? And Carrie, certainly you'll be able to weigh in when it comes to, the usage of PII and certain, information that is really very sensitive in nature.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in there because that is one of the premier reasons we built Finit AI the way we did. So I have a background in the intelligence community where it was my job to acquire data and acquire information on behalf of various organizations, and we did that through a variety of covert and overt means. So the first thing that we did when we said we're going to build an LLM and we're going to engage with LLMs is we made it so that it was a walled garden to where we get all the benefit of generative AI, and then we seeded it with the world's most expert curated governance, risk, and compliance data environment. And then we put it only in the hands of that client's enterprise user. So the difference between our business value prop and what, if you're using anybody else on the street, including the big guys, and that is they own your content. You type in a prompt, they run the mechanics behind the scenes. They're learning on everything inside your prompt, and they're using that to inform the model later. And they actually, in many cases, own that content. And then you have to fight through it to say, I just created something using my generative AI capability. Do I have the right intellectual property protections? Am I violating copyright issues? Do I have terms and condition violations? And to your question, Fabio, is am I leaking information back to the LLM? So what we design, and the reason why we're really the only ones out there that has this, is we are the anonymization layer between the LLMs, the data sources, and you as the user. So nobody sees what's going on. You own it in its entirety. You don't have to worry about copyright and IP because it's yours. And so that's a radical departure from what you see out there on the other ones. And believe me, this even goes if you're the enterprise custom pro versions, they still own the content. So we were very, very sensitive to that. And we wanted to do it. That being said, always, always, always make sure that before you drop PII into any LLM or any AI tooling, that your business processes and your legal department allows it. Because what happens is the regulators will look at that, and then they can go to the LLM provider and say, tell me how many times Bank A dropped a SAR narrative or dropped an account number into that LLM, and the LLM provider will give them the answer. And that is a fine per event. So be very, very cautious about that. Tassim, what do you say?
Right. So I would first start with training is the extreme scenario, in my opinion. And I think we're going to keep going back to this crawl, walk, run analogy. But for most users, agents are going to be able to achieve tasks such as summarization, helping to fill out missing details in documents, very innocuous things, right? So for most users, they will never need to train an LLM to perform a specialized task unless they need deep, specialized domain knowledge. So if I needed an LLM to say, answer a question about a particular document, I wouldn't necessarily need to train the model on that document because once it's trained, it's internalized, and then all bets are out the window. I mean, what we know is, sure, even if you wanted to train, you could perform procedures such as like PII scrubbing. But even then, so yeah, if you were to scrub a document, like redact everything that you deem sensitive before it goes to the model, then of course it's not going to be not going to be able to, what we say, regurgitate anything that it didn't even see to begin with. But for most users, I mean, think about it this way. So you have a system and you have a new, let's say like a developer that comes into it. Are you going to give them pseudo privileges? Are you going to give them, every single read write privilege that, say, an advanced cybersecurity administrator would have? No, not necessarily. So privacy is contextual, right? So if you walk into a hospital, a doctor at the end of the day will know your name, your age, your weight, your address, your medical history, because it's okay for that type of user in this scenario to know that. Does the security guard need to know that? No, they don't need to know that type of information. So someone like a user that doesn't need to know PII probably needs to deal with a checkpointed version of a large language model that has not trained on sensitive data. And instead, they can be using an agent to say, you can supply documents to an agent right now and ask it to summarize it. It does not mean it's learning over it, which is what we call retrieval augmented generation. Now, for users, more advanced users that need a model to essentially truly train and learn on sensitive data, then um, risk of exposure, the best way to minimize it is to limit the amount of people who could possibly see PII leakage and restrict that leakage to users for whom it is okay for them to see that. And then for them to say, okay, well, let me remove that for myself. So there are two ends of this. I don't think we need to train LLMs on every single piece of document that comes through our organization. And different users should have different checkpoints and versions of LLMs, some of which have trained over data containing PII, and some of which haven't trained over PII. And instead, you could achieve for 90% of your tasks, I would argue, what you need to do just by supplying a document to LLM as an external upload as opposed to training over it. So yeah, so right now the big issue that we don't have insurance is over restriction of PII leakage. Like for example, uh, I've seen scenarios where users or model trainers have used quote unquote these, we call them like adversarial training techniques to remove memorization of certain PII. And then once you prompt the model in a different language about this piece of knowledge that you thought you had supposedly scrubbed out, it's going to spit it back out. So training is the most extreme scenario, in my opinion. And for most users who just want to use agents to just fulfill, mundane, repetitive day-to-day tasks, they don't necessarily need to interact with models that have trained over PII. So long story short, the best way to prevent PII leakage is to not even train your model over documents that contain PII. If you have to do that, restrict those versions of those agents to users for whom it is okay for them to see PII or sensitive details, and then elect to remove that from whatever piece of document or action they're trying to take.
Right. And Carrie, I saw you shaking your head. Yes. So go ahead. You can have the last word on this before we move on to some other areas.
Obviously, this is a very this is a question or topic that's very, very important from coming from within a financial institution, right? So, although we may not have models trained on data sets involving PII, we're very focused on controlling user usage, right? So, even if you enter PII or social security number as within your prompt, right? It may not. It's not that the model is. It's not that it's now that the model knows that information, but it's seen it. It's kind of like your brain. You may not be memorizing something, but you see it, and so there's this general awareness that the model has now of this PII that's been entered from a user within a financial institution who may have entered customer information within their prompt, right? So we're very focused from a banking perspective on ensuring users are educated and understand what can and cannot be provided to the model. So as they're engaging with the model, entering information and asking for maybe a narrative summary, what are you allowed to enter into the prompt? So providing very structured guidance and training around prompt engineering, which I think is a whole nother topic that we could spend quite a bit of time on, the importance of ensuring that people know what they're asking and how they're asking the model to respond. And then also performing live screening. So ensuring that within an institution, you have controls around and the ability to detect when someone's trying to enter information that they shouldn't into a prompt for a narrative generation model that may be used across the bank, that the model before it even processes the prompt can detect what the user is trying to enter and say, and that's you can't enter a social security number, you can't enter yeah. And so it'll stop you before the user makes an error.
Yeah,
Well,
Joe,
and that actually that
let me pipe in there real quick on something because that is the crux of the problem. Sometimes we can enter in that information because it's published as part of a sanctions filing and it's part of a PEP file that we have. And sometimes we can't because maybe I, as an analyst, I'm copying a bank account number from a screen that I shouldn't be using. So it's these if then kind of conditional things that really have to have those policies in place. When can I do the following? When can I not? And under what conditions and who can do it? The challenge is that while that's easy to do from a policies and procedures function, it's easy to train the people. A lot of users don't understand what happens on the back end of where that information goes. And I think we have to get a lot of clarity from our providers about that. Thank you.
No, great insight there too, JR. I think this kind of leads into one of the other areas that I wanted to discuss, and that's really like around the regulatory engagement and kind of AI assurance frameworks that we have to have in place in order to, obviously utilize these tools correctly. Obviously, I think, to seen from your perspective, it's one of those things where training may not even necessarily come into the equation just based on what you're trying to accomplish. JR, what you've mentioned is more around, hey, here are some of the things to be mindful of, especially like pitfalls. But, Carrie, especially as you guys are continuing to try and develop these things within your institution, are there some good just basic rule of thumb type requirements or overall frameworks that you guys are either starting to build or that you're at least starting to think about or possibly have already put in place?
That one's coming to me. So, in terms of um, outset, right? We talked a little bit about roadmap, and I think that once you have established a vision for problems that you would like to try to solve, or where you think you can get faster and better using generative AI, looking across your existing governance and framework can be incredibly valuable, right? So, a lot of what you already have in place today is going to support your use of some of these models across your financial crimes prevention space. Likely you have a very strong and established model risk management policy and engagement with that team. So understanding how AI and generative AI specifically fits into their policy is a critical initial step when embarking on a journey of this nature. Understanding whether they have oversight and purview to perform some level of validation before the models are fully rolled out, and what that looks like, because it's certainly going to be different than what they do for traditional models per se. And then the remaining governance structure is also going to be relevant, right? So you've got controls in place, you've got required procedures and processes and senior management oversight and metrics and reporting, et cetera. So all of those existing controls are going to apply. And I've seen many institutions also establish a center of excellence as it relates to AI. So a team of specialists across the enterprise who represent the review and approval, perhaps, of various proofs of concept that various departments of the bank wish to pursue. So engaging with those folks, making sure they understand the venture that you're interested in pursuing, and often they can help prioritize that proof of concept or project across the bank, right? So they may rank initiatives that they wish to pursue as an enterprise, and you may or may not sort of fall into that top 10 list. In terms of success of some of the proofs of concept that we've seen, really incredible stuff, I think, that people are doing on the initial alert review process. So pulling together all the various elements that an analyst is currently required to evaluate according to a bank procedure when an alert is presented. We've really seen some very promising solutions there. A number of vendors, et cetera, that are coming to the table and saying, "Look, we can take transaction data that's been produced or been provided for the customer who's alerting. We can take your procedures, and we can take your required template in terms of your case management system and how the information is supposed to be presented. Feed that all in, and we can give you this initial." Prototype for an analyst to now review and say, okay, let me scrutinize what the machine has told me. Let me see if it's checked all of the necessary boxes, and let me evaluate how it summarized the customer behavior in order to make a very rapid decision as to whether it needs to go for further investigation and possible SAR filing.
I couldn't have said it better myself, let alone said it at all. Carrie, in terms of, and you kind of mentioned this too, but I do want to go back to the concept of the fact that, at the end of the day, that these tools are truly augmented, right? And like, this may be kind of old school, old timey, but at the end of the day, I'm constantly reminded that sometimes manual processes are the better way to do it. And not necessarily all the time, but when I think about the risks associated to incorporating kind of implementing these new types of tools, they do come with varied levels of risk and kind of things that you need to mitigate. Not everything is necessarily going to be a great fit, but when I think about like where the future not only of the space is going, but certainly just in general in terms of how to utilize these tools, there's kind of two things that come to mind. The first is your existing talent base, right? And like the skill set of your existing folks. Who's what are we doing in terms of being able to upskill and help folks understand how to run and oversee these tools? And then kind of in the same boat for the ones that get it is, how can we train folks to be better at prompting and better at optimizing their usage of these tools in a way that's going to be the most effective for the job at hand? So Tassine, I want to go to you first, just in general, in terms of, hey, here's where we're at. Here's some of the major components and things that we should all be thinking about when it comes to upskilling, as well as, any tips and tricks, Carrie, from your perspective in terms of how to better, position and certainly equip our folks to utilize these tools through prompting and other things.
Right. So I can start that off. So governance is very difficult. And the reason why is because agents and reasoning protocols change weekly. Seriously, like every single week, there's some type of shift in the way we train models and the way we interact with them. So having, leaders within your organization who stay on top of evolving research trends is entirely necessary. The tips and tricks that I would have offered a user for interacting with ChatGPT even last month is going to look radically different from what I would tell them how I would advise them to interact with ChatGPT now. But that's not necessarily, that's not a dead end. For individuals who provide curricula and education to, users at their companies, they need to stay on top of it and also be frequently interacting with these tools. It's not just enough to read about these tools, but to truly be sitting down there and be interacting with agents, not just from OpenAI, but also from Anthropic and even Quen or DeepSeek, even if you're not adopting those agents within your own organization. And that's entirely necessary because you can't really advise users on how to correctly engineer unless you have played with these agents yourselves. From the perspective of upskilling, um, there, I've noticed that organizations are starting to implement certifications, courses, and that is great. I mean, that is entirely necessary, and that needs to be expanded to such a level that even users who aren't interacting with agents probably still need to take these certs and courses anyways, because they might be interacting with these agents, very soon. But yeah, I think maintaining, you know, proactive knowledge on these tools is entirely necessary to, shielding your organization from adverse effects from users inappropriately prompting these models. So yeah, I think it's just staying vigilant and staying on top of these tools and actually going out and playing with them as much as possible.
Carrie, anything to add?
Yeah, I have to piggyback on that just because I like many institutions, right? Our bank has rolled out a workplace assistant solution that we can use for managing meetings and assisting with general documentation. So not specific to financial crimes, but more general. And as soon as that was offered at a broader scale, everyone wanted it, right? Everybody wanted their full license. And we required, my expectation was that we would build out use cases first. So let me know exactly how you intend to use this solution within your respective team. What are you aiming to achieve? How will you integrate the solution within your existing processes, et cetera? So forcing folks to really think about, how they may benefit from having access to the tool. But I do agree with Tassin. Sometimes you don't know what's possible until you kind of get your hands on it and start to play around and figure out what works and what doesn't work. It can be very overwhelming for people who have been doing a certain type of work for many years to and probably much like the availability of the internet, right? I mean, it's very shocking to some folks who have maybe are ingrained in their careers and have been doing similar processes for a long time. So ensuring that folks are comfortable and have the support internally. um the percentage of folks who have an increased fear of job loss related to AI has increased substantially from 2024 to 2025. And so making sure that folks feel supported, that they have managers who are teaching them how to use the solutions to make their jobs better and easier, and then showing them what they'll be doing instead of their prior roles or responsibilities is definitely critical. And then lastly on that piece, providing support for prompt engineering. It can be very overwhelming to figure out what to ask the model, and sometimes you'll get an unexpected or non-valuable response. But if you had a little bit of help in structuring the question correctly, or asking for the information in a better way, you wouldn't feel so perhaps defeated. So we've been focused on compiling structured prompts for various tasks and activities that we collectively across our enterprise financial crimes compliance team are pulling together. So we have an inventory of prompts for certain activities, which has been very useful for folks.
Yeah, Jill, I think it ties back to the traditional AI, generative AI, and the future of AI that we talked about in the beginning. And what I'll tell you is this: I'm a little worried when we have conversations about talent. If I look at the job descriptions and I look at the workforce plans at financial institutions, for example, they are built for old AI, the traditional AI. They use the wording of the traditional AI. They have the themes of traditional AI. They don't have realistic assessment or realistic job hiring performance criteria and qualifications for where we are in today's AI. Furthermore, I don't see many financial institutions that have a visionary leader that is willing to stake a flag in the ground and say, here's where we're going for the future of AI. It may be transformative from where the bank is currently, but it is not representative of where the industry is going. So what does that mean for talent? Well, if I'm a mid-level AI practitioner, I'm not sure that GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, is going to move fast enough for me anymore. I might be looking to pivot into another industry. If I'm entry level into the GRC space and I have generative AI skills, I'm not going into banks. I'm not going into vendors. I'm not going into GRC at all. I'm going into payment processors, backend systems integrators. I'm going into wallet providers, or I'm going into an entirely different industry. The financial institutions and the regulators are moving at a speed that was barely enough to keep up with traditional AI. They're certainly not moving at a speed that is going to keep up with current AI, and they're not showing that they're making changes in their decisioning and prioritization and execution protocols to leverage everything that is the future of AI. So in 2 to 3 years, I think over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see this exodus of talent that is going to go into other areas because that's where the exciting stuff is. And I think the banks and I think the regulators better get ready for it. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just saying, saddle up.
Well, JR, at the risk of essentially saying shots fired, there is something to be said though, right? And that is there's the reality of the situation, and then there's on both sides. And so trying to figure out, for institutions, like how is it that we can again upskill and train this new generation of analysts and this new generation of compliance professionals in order to handle the realistic threats that are out there.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily share your opinions 100%, but it's certainly worth calling out. And I'm conscious of time, so I know we've got a couple minutes left here. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to kind of, weigh in with final thoughts here. So, Tassine, I'll let you go, and then Carrie, you can have the last word.
Sure. So, I would say that agents are coming for your organization, regardless of whether or not you vehemently disagree with the usage of LLMs to complete tasks. I mean, at the end of the day, if you mistrust them, start by working on very low stakes, low risk tasks, such as like summarization, grammar checking, things like this. Build comfortability with them. And you'll be amazed at just how efficient they are at completing mundane tasks. On the flip side of it, uh, they can't replace deep domain knowledge or deep human expertise at this point in time. Um, so regard the tool as augmenting what you know. And Joe, we talk about this so frequently, but the agent is simply helping you complete a task that you could complete if given enough time, but you'd like to spend your time working on more, you know, substantial tasks in your time. So just, you know, at this point in time, agents are simply going to be used to augment, human expertise. So in that sense, view them as assistants. You don't need to view them as essentially omnipotent beings that live, within your administration systems to do any possible task. They just can't do that right now. Maybe we will get there at some point in the future. I don't know when that will be or if that will ever happen. But yeah, just start educating yourselves on what agents are, how you could use them, and start playing with them just in your free time. Obviously, if your organization has a restriction on the uses of agents, please don't use them when you're at work. Even if you're using it on a second laptop, please don't do that. But yeah, just build familiarity with them and then just view them from the lens of acting as your assistant as opposed to replacing you and your expertise. Yeah.
Tessie, I will double down on that. We use the analogy interns. I will never pass up the opportunity to bring as many interns as are available right onto my team so that they can help, they can learn, and allow us to shift our focus to some other higher criticality activities. We view the agents in the same way. Keep an eye on those interns though, right? You've got to maintain the human in loop, make sure the interns are meeting expectations or the agents, right? And that you're checking the work, right? That it seems reasonable, that it is as expected, et cetera. My closing remark, I think from a monitoring and detection perspective, AI is going to transform the AML space from a sort of a field of passive monitoring to more active pursuit. We're bringing speed, adaptability, context awareness to our decision making in a space that I've been in for since 9/11, and I've seen that we've just been hampered for decades by inefficiency and false positives, and I know that we're on the brink of really changing, revolutionizing all of that, and we're moving at a rate that I personally never could have anticipated, right? And Tessine and I are in Chicago, so maybe I'll just reference, good old Ferris Bueller that life moves pretty fast, right? So if you don't stop to look around a little bit here, you could miss it. So keep up with the pace of change and continue to play with the agents as Tessine suggested. That's the best way to learn.
And don't let the valet drive off with your dad's Ferrari, right? No, guys, just wanted to say thank you. I think the overarching message here is number one, the conversation has to continue in terms of, where we're going, certainly some of the challenges that are associated with implementing and integrating these new tools and to our experts' points today. The world is evolving, it's moving fast. And so at the very least, do your best to try and just stay abreast on some of the developments. But again, just wanted to thank our panelist experts as well as you, the audience, for participating in today's live stream. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we'll get you out of here. Number one, recording of today's session will be available on the AML RightSource website, as well as you'll receive a follow-up email with a direct link so you can watch these on demand. Please use them, train with them, send them to your friends, show your friends. The other piece too. So with the conclusion of today's live stream, that means that we have an upcoming program in August, and we're going to be joined by moderator John Byrne, who is the chairman of the advisory board here at AML RightSource, as well as presenters Don Fort, former IRS CI chief and current director of investigations at Castellanets, as well as Ulysses Pineda, who is the director of financial crimes and head of fraud investigations at First Citizens. They're going to be tackling the topic of coping with the growing fraud threat. That will happen on August 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We hope all of you can join us for that. And a final shout out. So our European team, as well as for our European audience, just a heads up, our AML Right Source team will actually be participating, as well as hosting two thoughts leadership events during the One LOD Financial Crime Summit in London on September 11th. So please be on the lookout for more details on that in the coming weeks on our website and social platforms. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next month. Bye, everybody.